Good afternoon. Welcome to what I think is our 13th annual Constitution Day activity, believe it or not. Dr. Fierro and I were reminiscing about some of the different topics we've talked about over the years. I'd just like to introduce the panelists, and then we're going to get started. Today the topic is the Imperial Presidency, so we will learn what that means. We'll look at some examples of it, and we'll look at this from various aspects and angles. So in order of presentation, I hate to put myself first, but I'm going first. I'm Dr. Fran Coan. I'm the Social Sciences Chair. I'll be starting the event, followed by Professor Bob Brown to my left, Dr. Rafaele Fierro to my right, and then finally Professor Andre Blaszczynski to my far left. So sit back, relax, take some notes. We will try to leave some time for questions and answers at the end. That, to me, is the most enjoyable part of this, actually, is to hear what's on your minds. So today, I'm going to sit now. The film. We're going to explore what the authors of the Federalist Papers wrote about the role of human nature in the creation and maintenance of Republican government in America. More specifically, I'll be examining their thoughts on how both the positive and negative aspects of human behavior could be harnessed to make likely that the office of the President of the United States would always be occupied by a person qualified to hold that office and who would not possess the ability or inclination to overthrow the system. Now, if you're not familiar with the Federalist Papers, you can find these online, by the way, very easily, the whole collection. There were a series of 85 letters that were originally printed in New York City newspapers between October 1787 and August 1788. Three men penned the letters. You're probably familiar with two of the names, maybe not the third. Alexander Hamilton wrote most of them. James Madison wrote most of the rest. And John Jay wrote 5. Madison and Hamilton collaborated on 3 of them. The immediate purpose of these letters was to influence the constitutional ratification vote in New York and Virginia, where approval of the Constitution was in doubt. And ultimately, as you probably know, both of those states did vote to ratify the Constitution, though the votes were close. So in the Federalist Papers, the 3 authors examined the Constitution section by section, seeking to prove that it was possible to augment the power of the national government while still safeguarding the powers of the individual states and the rights and liberties of the people. While the papers are a brilliant analysis of the Constitution, really indispensable, once you keep in mind they were also argumentative essays meant to influence decision-makers' opinions. So they are biased in that sense. So what view of human nature did Hamilton, Madison, and Jay offer in the Federalist Papers? In many ways, it was not a particularly encouraging or optimistic one. All 3 men rejected the establishment of a democratic system of government in America because they believed the people at large did not possess the wisdom, knowledge, or selflessness, or to use the contemporary term, virtue, to govern well. Rather, they embraced a republican system where, in Madison's words, this is from Federalist number 10, decisions would be made by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. So they weren't lovers of democracy. They didn't trust democracy. For the same reasons, the 3 men agreed that the people should not directly elect the President of the United States. In Federalist number 68, Hamilton explains the Electoral College, what role it would play. It was desirable that the sense of the people should operate in the choice of the person to whom so important a trust was to be confided. It was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. The process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fall to the lot of any man who has not an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. Well, we could look back and say, I don't know if it really worked out the way it was supposed to, but that was the theory. So rather than the people directly choosing the president, this small body of electors had and still has the ultimate say. In brief, all three men concluded that an educated, rational elite chosen on the basis of merit should make the key political decisions in the new constitutional order, not the people, or at least not directly the people. On the other hand, they were not so naive as to believe that even the best and most virtuous leaders could escape their human frailties, weaknesses, and limitations. All people, they believed, were prone to sacrificing the greater good in pursuit of self-interest. In Federalist number 1, Hamilton, writing about the debate over the ratification of the Constitution, admitted, "Happy will it be if our choice should be directed by a judicious estimate of our true interests, unperplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good. But this is a thing more ardently to be wished than seriously to be expected." In Federalist number 10, Madison writes about the dangers of faction. As long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. We're contentious creatures. We don't get along. We want what we want, and often at the expense of others. Nor did Madison hold out much hope that wise, virtuous political leaders were the cure for factionalism. It is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. Not surprisingly, given their rather dim view of human nature, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay spent many pages in the Federalist Papers explaining various mechanisms and processes which were built into the constitutional system that were intended to compensate for any lack of virtue on the part of the citizenry and political leadership. And without getting into great detail, these include the principle of federalism, sharing of power between the national government and state governments, separation of powers, which you all learn in school, I'm sure, checks and balances, and one could throw in, several years later, what became the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Many of these mechanisms sought, rather ingeniously and ironically, to enlist human selfishness as a bodyguard for liberty. In Federalist 51, Madison, explaining separation of powers, argued, brilliantly, the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department, and by that he meant branch of government, the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for defense must in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. In Federalist 70, Hamilton discusses the need for what he called energy in the executive branch. And in Federalist 76, he makes a compelling argument that we really want one chief executive, not a council, not several people. Of course, arguably, the problem is a single energetic man is the one most likely to threaten the system, to want to seize power. In Federalist 72, Hamilton offered a way that perhaps psychology could safeguard against that threat. And what he was arguing for was the possibility of a president serving multiple terms, interestingly enough. So he argued that there should not be term limits on the president. One ill effect of the exclusion would be a diminution of the inducements to good behavior. There are few men who would not feel much less zeal in the discharge of the duty when they were conscious that the advantages of the station with which it was connected must be relinquished at a determinate period, than when they were permitted to entertain a hope of obtaining by meriting a continuance of them. In other words, he was arguing that if presidents knew they could run for a second term, they'd be more likely to behave. in the hopes of winning re-election, of meriting a chance to be re-elected. Conversely, he pointed out in the same paper, another ill effect of the exclusion would be the temptation to sordid views, to peculation, and in some cases to usurpation, seizure of power. The same man, probably with a different prospect before him, i.e. the possibility of being re-elected, might content himself with the regular perquisites of his situation, and might even be unwilling to risk the consequences of an abuse of his opportunities. His avarice might be a guard upon his avarice. So in short, if the new constitutional system could not guarantee virtuous behavior, it could at least increase the possibility of virtuous outcomes generated by faction and self-interest. It reminds me of that rule in mathematics where you add two negative numbers together and you don't get a negative, you get a positive. That's sort of what they're arguing here. And we can actually use the dark side of human nature to our advantage here and actually safeguard the system, to safeguard liberty. While the authors of the Federalist Papers acknowledged the limitations of civic virtue, they did not reject this ideal as fantasy, and they pointed out that humans are, at least at times, capable of transcending their petty nature. In Federalist 55, Madison wrote, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form." John Jay, in particular, offered in a couple of the Federalist Papers the idea that the new system of government would actually foster and encourage virtuous behavior in voters and political leaders alike. In Federalist 64, Jay argued that since the select assemblies for choosing the president, meaning the Electoral College, as well as the state legislatures who appoint the senators, will in general be composed of the most enlightened and respectable citizens, there is reason to presume that their attention and their votes will be directed to those men only who have become the most distinguished by their abilities and virtue, and in whom the people perceive just grounds for confidence. He added that the human desire for fame, status, and public esteem, sometimes viewed as negative traits, might actually be employed to enhance the possibility of the various presidents of the United States executing their duties faithfully and well. Every consideration that can influence the human mind, such as honor, oaths, reputations, conscience, the love of country, and family affections and attachments, afford security for the fidelity. So, in other words, if people cared about their reputations, that would be an additional safeguard. In summary, the authors of the Federalist Papers shared a keen understanding of human nature and its vital role in government. They advocated for a new and in some ways revolutionary political system that struck a balance between idealism and realism. To conclude with one more excerpt, which really summarizes this presentation I just gave brilliantly. This is from, again, Federalist 10, James Madison. "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. The dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions." Thank you.
Hello. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Coan for that introduction. I think it frames the conversation well. And more immediately, students in my American Government U.S. History 1 classes, you've already heard that, at least some of it. So just sometimes we repeat it. And that happened very recently in other classes, yesterday in American Government, 2 days ago in American Government, this morning in U.S. History. So let me first start by stating that many presidents have been accused during their tenure of having imperial aspirations. Critics of Andrew Jackson, our second president, didn't refer to him as an emperor. They called him King Andrew, and accused him of attempting to impose his will on Congress and a nation, many of whose citizens disagreed with him. So particularly true in the case of a situation in which Andrew Jackson ordered the removal of the Creek Indians from basically the state of Georgia, migration out to the west, and what became known as the Trail of Tears. Several hundred Creeks and Cherokee died on the way out. And Andrew Jackson did this despite a decision by the Supreme Court that he had really no right to do so. In his response, when someone pointed out to him that the Supreme Court said you can't do this, he asked how many divisions does the Supreme Court have under its command. In other words, I command the military, I do what I want to do. Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, oversaw the nation during our dark and bloody Civil War, actually did assume imperial responsibilities. He basically, for the duration of the war, suspended civil liberties. He reserved for himself the right to decide who should go to prison for opposition to the war and who should pay what penalties. He did this in the name of preserving the Union. Both President Theodore Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson heard anti-imperialist critics accused of a massive overreach when they committed U.S. troops to protect the nation's perceived economic interests in Central and South America. Theodore Roosevelt's distant nephew, Franklin Roosevelt, was accused during the Great Depression of expanding the authority of government in ways that were new and frightening to his legion of critics. His New Deal, to Roosevelt's detractors, was nothing more than a first step toward totalitarian rule. Yet the term imperial presidency itself can ultimately be traced back to a particular time and a particular issue. The issue was the late 1960s and early 1970s. The issue was the Vietnam War. Critics of the war thought that they saw massive presidential overreach in the events that led to our cataclysmic military involvement in Vietnam. The term actually can be traced in its modern incarnation to a 1973 book entitled, naturally enough, The Imperial Presidency. It was written by historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and it reflected one element in the climate of opinion at the time. Schlesinger's argument was essentially that global events in the modern era had gotten so complicated, so fast-paced, that presidents had come to believe that the traditional structure of American government, which Dr. Coan just talked about in such length, could not accommodate events. And the presidents had felt the need to move to fill the gap. In particular, Schlesinger argued that people who were our presidents had moved to act militarily and unnecessarily without first seeking the Congress's approval to do so. The Constitution designates the President as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States, but it also gives to Congress the power to declare war, and only Congress the power to declare war. That the President is our Commander-in-Chief, as I said, is responsible under Article 2 of the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. It was in this separation of responsibilities and the fact of presidential overreach that Schlesinger saw the origins of an imperial presidency. The American people had pretty much consistently granted extraordinary power to the president during wartime. But Schlesinger argued they had historically taken that power back after the war crisis abated. That didn't happen, Schlesinger argued, after World War II. What happened then was that a Cold War with the Soviet Union followed hard on the heels of our victory in the hot war that was World War II. The Cold War was not, of course, an actual shooting war with the Soviets. Both sides were armed to the teeth, and by 1949, 1950, both had nuclear weapons, so an actual U.S.-Soviet confrontation was unthinkable. Yet there was still the perceived fight for global domination between us and them, and the conviction that every global conflict ultimately reduced itself to superpowers. In 1950, North Korea, a proxy for the Soviet Union, invaded the pro-American nation of South Korea. The invasion was so sudden and so unexpected that American and South Korean troops were almost pushed into the Sea of Japan before the tide turned. Rather than ask Congress to declare a war so soon on the heels of World War II, President Harry Truman turned to the newly created United Nations for support. He asked the UN to take the formal burden of resisting the North Korean assault. At the same time, Truman committed American troops to do the bulk of the fighting. In the end, nearly 129,000 American soldiers were killed, or wounded rather, and almost 4,000 Americans killed in a war that ended inconclusively and that neither Congress nor the nation had formally declared. While the troops were mostly American, they fought under the flags of the United Nations, including the many flags of the United Nations. Over the next decade, the presidential authority grew. Even members of Congress, Schlesinger argued, seemed to agree that modern times necessitated the type of quick action that the Constitution could not accommodate. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was seen to be the ultimate proof. Evidence demonstrated conclusively that the Soviets were attempting to put short-range nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. President John Kennedy did consult with congressional leaders and others, but he acted unilaterally throughout the crisis. The end of the crisis with the withdrawal of Soviet missiles seemed to confirm the value of quick, decisive presidential action, even if it meant skirting congressional prerogatives. President Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, pushed forward the doctrine of unilateral presidential action. Unrest in the Dominican Republic led Johnson in 1964 to commit 22,000 troops to the Dominican Republic without formal congressional approval. Johnson followed this intervention with a decision to commit troops to preserve the government of our allies, South Vietnam. This time, Johnson did seek congressional approval in the form of what was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a response to what was apparently, and in one case did turn out to be, North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. warships in the waters off the coast of Vietnam. The resolution, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorized the president to take whatever actions he deemed necessary to protect American interests in the region, a breathtakingly open-ended commitment. Congress readily embraced the notion of logic of the Imperial Presidency. The House of Representatives voted without opposition to approve the resolution. Only 2 senators opposed it when the Senate voted. Thus began our involvement in Vietnam, involvement that lasted into the 1970s. Its peak saw more than 500,000 soldiers committed and more than 50,000 Americans dead by combat, ended only when North Vietnam defeated the South Vietnamese militarily and occupied all of Vietnam. Not at the beginning of the war, but during and after the Vietnam War, Congress tried to reassert its role. I think by the early 1970s, it had become pretty clear to the nation and to many in Congress that basically it had given Johnson too much of a grant of power in the approval of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So first, Congress voted to rescind the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution after Johnson left the presidency, the new President Richard Nixon. Then it passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, which requires the president to consult with Congress before committing troops without seeking a formal declaration of war. What has been the result of Congress's attempt to reassert its power since the Vietnam War? Pretty spotty at best. Since the passage of the War Powers Act, presidents of the United States have committed U.S. troops to an invasion of Grenada and an incursion into Panama without first getting congressional approval. The first President Bush did seek congressional approval for the first Gulf War, and the second President Bush sought approval for the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. While there was debate in Congress over both requests, the presidents got essentially what they wanted, an agreement to commit troops without a declaration of war. The debate in the Senate over the second Gulf War resolution was intense. It was a bitterly contested debate, but in the end, the Senate gave President George W. Bush the authority that he wanted to commit troops. Thus, the legacy of the Imperial Presidency, as Schlesinger perceived it, remains in place today. And before leaving the topic, I'd have to say, in time, too, the notion of the Imperial Presidency has grown beyond issues of war making. President Obama, a Democrat, has been accused, I think with reason, of circumventing a Congress controlled by the rival Republican Party, which would not approve his initiatives, by resorting to a series of executive orders to implement policy that Congress, under Republican control, would never approve. I should say I think that criticism is fair and just. I would also balance it by saying that I voted for President Obama twice, and were he to run again, I'd probably vote for him again. So I think he's wrong, but I don't think that his failures in this area are fatal. So a process that began with war-making power in the era of the Cold War has extended into peacetime, and the authority of the Imperial Presidency, I think, continues to grow at the expense of the mechanisms described by Dr. Coan, designed to check the power of the presidency. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I want to build on what Professor Brown said by talking about the president in the realm of foreign policy. And the obvious conclusion to me is that he has obtained way too much power, and this is not at all what the founders intended. Put it another way, Congress, the legislative branch, has lost the power that the framers rightfully placed in its hands. So if the Imperial Presidency is a problem, it is as much a problem of the legislature as it is of the executive. In fact, I think we ought to be talking not only about an imperial president, but also an impotent Congress. And it has been made impotent by a combination of cowardly behavior, presidents who crave power, and a bloated modern bureaucracy which has taken power out of the place where it was intended. So the founders gave the legislature lots of power in foreign policy. In particular, let's look at it. So Article 1, Section 8, which is 429 words long, mind you, that's twice the length of the powers spelled out for the executive branch, gives Congress the power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. It gives Congress the power to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for the calling forth of the militia to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections and repel invasions, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and also, of course, the power to declare war. So why did the framers place this power in the hands of Congress? Well, the quick answer is to ensure that in military matters, especially warfare, deliberation and discussion takes place, that thoughtful and careful decisions are made, and that we do not rush into a conflict where people die all too hastily. George Washington said the following in 1793, quote, "The Constitution vests the power of declaring war in Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after they," meaning Congress, "shall have deliberated upon the subject and authorized such a measure." So clearly, founders intended there to be deliberation and dialogue and discussion about something as serious as going to war. Thomas Jefferson, he said this in 1805 when he was president, "Considering that Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war, I have thought it my duty to await their authority for using force in any degree which could be avoided." And James Madison, often considered the father of the Constitution, said, "The power to declare war, including the power of judging the causes of war, is fully and exclusively vested in the legislature." So the executive has no right in any case, he continued, to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. So I think it's pretty clear just from these three, and there were other quotations from the other founders as well, that the power to declare war in particular rested with Congress. So then the question is, what changed? Now, Professor Brown is right. I mean, all presidents have the aspiration to be an imperial president. I think it's human nature for political leaders to crave power. But, you know, the examples that Professor Brown gave of the 19th century, Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, these were good examples of individuals craving power. But then after Lincoln, there were a series of presidents who wanted no power and took a backseat to the business leaders of the day during the Gilded Age. I don't know that too many people remember what Chester Arthur did, or James Garfield, or for that matter, Grover Cleveland. These were not the most visible presidents, and that's the way they wanted it. So what changed for me, the way I see it, is the 20th century. The modern era brings about fundamental changes in the way we conceive of the presidency. And I do think it, in large measure, begins with two very strong forces in the White House, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. They were the presidents of the so-called progressive era. Teddy Roosevelt was perhaps our most masculine president. He prided himself on being masculine and manly in the way he spoke. He also was a boxer, and so his mere personality contributed to the idea that the president needs to be a powerful figure in government. Woodrow Wilson was, in some sense, cut from the same cloth, though not a boxer. He believed that a good president should take charge of any situation, foreign policy or domestic policy for that matter, And he also believed that the Constitution often got in the way of swift and strong executive leadership. And he set the tone, I believe, for much of the 20th century. I would say, though, that the emergence of the Imperial Presidency, it really accelerated after World War II, and in some measure because of World War II. There was this craving on the part of the world to have no more Holocausts, no more totalitarianism. We only wish that we had seen the last of people like Hitler and Mussolini and so on. And because the United States emerged from the Second World War as the most powerful country in the world, we were the only ones who could do something of the rise of any kind of future totalitarianism. Now, unfortunately, the end of World War II was quickly followed by the rise of communism. And that created more of a sense of urgency on the part of U.S. leaders. The stakes were way too high for having decisions that needed to be made quickly, having this get bogged down on the part of a legislature that had to deliberate slowly and cautiously. There was no time for that anymore. What you needed was swift action. And I think at this point in time, legislatures took on this kind of reputation for being too squeamish to deal with some of the greatest of foreign threats. So certainly the climate of World War II, that the Cold War continued and intensified, had a lot to do with why the president now takes center stage. Added to that, after World War II, during and after, we have the start of the so-called air age, which made it necessary for foreign policy decisions to be made quickly. Now war could be brought to a country within, hours, not necessarily days or months. It didn't take as long. And so, considering the fact that it took quite a long time for Congress to deliberate, you needed a strong executive to make snap decisions. So clearly, these technological advancements that were now part of the world had an impact too. And I will say that this isn't often considered as a reason for the Imperial Presidency, but the rise of television contributed too, because it created the impression that the president is the commander, and perhaps even the only one who matters. The president becomes much more visible, and it created the appearance that he was in charge. And so television, I would say, since World War II has contributed to the idea that the president makes the decisions. And because we are a visual people, we live in a visual culture, on some level we bought into that idea. There is another development, though, after World War II that needs to be noted. And that is that you have, not overnight, in piecemeal fashion, little by little, in drips and drabs, you have the creation of a modern bureaucracy within the federal government that has become so swollen as to further place foreign policy in the hands of an executive branch and out of the hands of Congress. Sometimes this bureaucracy gets so out of control that not even the president is in complete control of it. Since World War II, here's what has happened. In addition to the State Department, we've had that already, but after World War II, it becomes necessary to beef up American security because of the fight against communism. Okay. The State Department increases its bureaucracy to the point that where today we have more than 13,000 employees in the State Department, 11,000 civil service men and women, and 45,000 civil service local employees, all in one department that is in charge of foreign policy in some way. But after World War II, you also have the creation of the Defense Department, which now has 742,000 civilian personnel. At the same time, the same year, 1947, Congress, ironically, created the National Security Council with hundreds, if not thousands, of workers working for that agency. Also in 1947, so you can see this sense of urgency, Congress created the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. But a little known fact that goes alongside the CIA is that there are 14 other agencies that deal with intelligence in our modern bureaucracy. And by the way, the CIA employs a publicly unknown number of people. It won't give you that information, and if I can find it, it just doesn't exist. By the way, also, when Congress first conceived of the CIA, it wrote what its function was, and it was, quote, to perform all duties related to intelligence. That's what its function was. I suppose that could mean assassinating world leaders, fomenting revolutions, and stopping others. So you can see the kind of runaway power the CIA obtained. Not that it wasn't necessary. You know, the Soviet Union had its own version of it, called the KGB. But nonetheless, this is a modern-day fact that this swells the bureaucracy, and it becomes much more difficult for government to work and to carry out foreign policy in an organized, unilateral way. Also, of course, since 9/11, we have the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which has added a further few thousand people to America's security forces. So it has become nearly impossible to coordinate these activities of the various arms of foreign policy. Now, in theory, all of these departments are under the control of the president, but it's hard to imagine that the president knows exactly what's going on all the time to create kind of uniform foreign policy. The result is what Professor Brown described. Since the end of World War II, the United States has been engaged in many conflicts, some small, some large. Korea was called not a war, but a police action. Vietnam. Also, we have the first Persian Gulf War, and yes, President Bush, the senior, he did request a declaration of war from Congress, but he also said in that same sentence that he didn't need one. He was just doing it, but he didn't need it. And I don't believe that was an officially declared war. So, on paper it sounds good that Congress can declare war, but that's not how it's unfolded. And we also have the Bosnian War in the 1990s, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. Professor Brown mentioned Grenada, Panama. There have been several conflicts. We have not declared war in this country since 1941, since the Second World War. And that should make us all concerned, if we're concerned at all about the Constitution. Okay. Now, it's also important to note that once these kinds of actions happen, and I think Schlesinger alerted us to this, it's hard to take that power that a president takes back. Even though the initial reasons why a president took the power in the first place are now off the table. They're no longer relevant, and yet the power continues in some other form. Professor Brown also noted how President Obama has claimed executive privilege, executive action in dealing with domestic policy and foreign policy. Well, that's a case in point. So, to sum up, Congress has relinquished its power to the president, who in turn has ceded it to a bloated bureaucracy that often does things behind closed doors. The people who run these agencies, by the way, they were not elected by the people. So it's hard in a democracy to hold people accountable when they oftentimes act covertly, behind the scenes. For sure, the vast majority of them are good people, but taken collectively, this does pose a challenge, if not a direct threat, to our democracy and, of course, to the U.S. Constitution. Thank you.
Last night I saw a couple of politicians pretend that they knew something about economics. So today I feel empowered to pretend I know something about constitutional law. Unless you think that the Imperial Presidency is only relating to foreign and defense policy, I'm not going to mention any of that stuff. So my talk is a little bit different. From a couple of law courses I took in graduate school, I know that there are three sources of law in the United States. One is legislative law, laws passed by the legislature; case law, decisions by the court in interpreting and applying the law passed by the legislature and precedents established by courts; and administrative law, rules, regulations, and orders issued and promulgated by administrative bodies in order to enforce the laws passed by the legislature and the decisions of the judiciary. Now, this seemed consistent with the civics lesson I learned in junior high. about the system of checks and balances, otherwise known as the division of power between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government. That's the system our founders of the American Republic enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. However, in the same law courses and from simple observation over the years, I realized that this system was being subverted and cast aside as if it were just a quaint but impractical notion. People have less and less patience for the slow and cumbersome system of making political decisions. They want government to do something quickly and have no patience for gridlock, not realizing that occasional gridlock is the price we pay for preventing dictatorship and preserving a Republican form of government. By the way, most of the stuff I'm going to talk about is based on a couple of sources. One is the Administrative Law Unlawful, a book by Philip Hamburger, and then there's a statistical report on regulation. Anyways, I just wanted to mention that. It's not all original. Now, Philip Hamburger, in his book titled The Administrative Law, Administrative Law Unlawful, argues that when the executive branch acts to enforce or implement the laws and decisions of the legislature or the courts, these acts are constitutional and legal. But when the executive branch exceeds this authority of the legislature or the judiciary to constrain liberty of people subject to the jurisdiction of law, such actions are unconstitutional and illegal. Worse, it is not only unconstitutional but anti-constitutional and destructive of the very concept of rule of law. Administrative law today is not just supporting legislative and case law, it is subsuming and supplanting both. Administrative agencies today promulgate rules that have the power to materially limit liberties, and in its effect are indistinguishable from laws passed by legislatures. The same agencies set up administrative courts and judicial procedures that are, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from regular courts, and yet separate and parallel. Moreover, the regular judiciary tends to defer to these administrative courts. So rather than have a liberty defined by law, Americans now enjoy liberty defined largely by administrative power. Today's huge regulatory apparatus of the government is part and parcel of this construct. Now, practitioners and apologists for administrative law explain its encroachment on the legislative and judicial law-giving authority as an outcome of the growing complexity and dynamism of the modern world, even we heard before. In this world, the cumbersome system of divided power set up by our Constitution is just impractical. The Constitution should be a living document and allow for more modern approaches to solving society's problems. But as Philip Hamburger points out, there's very little new in this idea of the executive administrative branch encroaching on the legislative and judicial branches. It is the same as the old concept of prerogative, usually claimed by a king, or in other words, absolute power. The similarities are striking. Both involve sidestepping the regular legal process and institutions. In this, they are both extra-legal, outside the established law. And since the regular judiciary usually defers to them, they are both supra-legal, above the law. Most importantly, functioning outside the law and above the law, they both constitute and engender a concentration of power. But the whole point of Anglo-American constitutional law and tradition has always been to constrain absolute power by preventing anyone, especially the king or the executive, from acting outside or above the law and making sure to divide power lest it become concentrated in the hands of the king or the executive. So indeed, administrative law is not just unconstitutional, it is anti-constitutional. Perhaps the most famous instance of executive branch or administrative law-giving is the Emancipation Proclamation. But this was an exceptional case issued in exceptional circumstances in the midst of the horrific Civil War, dealing with an issue of exceptional import and the casus belli, the cause of the war. One could argue even that the proclamation corrected one flaw in the Constitution that detracted from its legitimacy and legality. After all, codification of evil is typically considered to make the code itself illegitimate and illegal. Nevertheless, I believe that President Lincoln's executive order was thought unconstitutional by many of his contemporaries, including those who were against slavery and supported the Union cause. Now, I'm not an expert in the Civil War, so if I'm mistaken about this, I hope my historic colleagues will correct me. In any case, Congress obviously thought it necessary to codify the end of slavery with constitutional amendments, 3 of them, 13, 14, 15, and legislation of the Reconstruction. The point is that as long as administrative extralegal or supralegal action was the exception, it did not alter the nature of our legal and political system. While some argue that these exceptions establish legal precedents for modern administrative law, again, Philip Hamburger disagrees, claiming that the legitimacy of constitutionality of administrative law per se has never been adjudicated by the Supreme Court. But in modern times, the exception has swallowed the rule. Administrative law has, by now, dwarfed statutory law and has become the federal government's pervasive mode of dealing with the public. Therefore, rather than merely a means of completing the work of Congress and the courts at the margin, administrative power has become central. Administrative law nowadays offers a large-scale alternative to governance through the acts of Congress and the judgments of the courts. Probably the most convincing justification for modern administrative law is the proposition that it is merely the delegation of legislative or judicial powers by the legislature and the judiciary. Congress seems only too eager to write laws that set a broad policy goal and then establish regulatory agencies and charge them to figure out how to attain these goals. The judiciary is also keen to defer to administrative law, partially because of the notion that indeed it represents a delegation of power by the legislature. Of course, one can ask whether Congress has the power to delegate its own legislative authority. Whereas Philip Hamburger again points out, the ultimate source of law-giving authority derives from the citizenry. On the other hand, if this delegation to a government agency is subject to congressional oversight and judicial review, most fears would be allayed. Unfortunately, recent history has put the notion of legislative oversight and judicial review in doubt. Recent experience of government agencies stonewalling and slow-walking replies to congressional subpoenas, the surrender of institutional loyalty for the sake of party partisanship, the political poison of government shutdowns in an attempt to use the power of the purse, and the same sorry experience of impeachment as a means to rein in the executive branch all seem to augur the end of congressional oversight. The administrative agencies are free to ride roughshod over Congress. For my Democrat friends who seem pleased to protect the Democratic administration, I will simply suggest that if Republicans took the same tack in the 1970s, President Nixon would have finished out this second term. The next hope of reining in the excesses of administrative law and executive power is the judiciary. But the judiciary tends to defer to the administrative courts, and judging by recent Supreme Court cases and the opinions of half the current justices, it seems that the court will likely affirm the constitutionality of administrative law and the legislative and judicial power of government agencies. I know that Republicans look with favor on Donald Trump's Supreme Court candidate pick list, but I would advise tempering that happiness with the realization that Trump is as much an autocrat as any progressive lefty, and who knows what additional executive powers he will covet. To make things worse, the government regulatory bureaucracy, now free from oversight and review, has also been growing in size, unaccountability, and arrogance. The civil service system, once a great accomplishment of civilization, has been perverted into a system devoid of any accountability. The public sector unions have added another layer of arbitrary power to isolate the agencies against any outside scrutiny or intervention. And legislation and administrative rules have been forced through to make sure this power of unions and bureaucrats is made permanent and impenetrable. For all the scandals in today's government, no one has been fired or disciplined. Witness the Veterans Administration scandal for one. So we can look forward to an ever-expanding and ever more powerful regulatory raj. A power unto itself, governing for its own interest, unaccountable, and unstoppable. This regime engenders a culture that cares not whether any public interest is actually served, that perversely uses the claim of serving the public good to justify raw and increasing corruption. In other words, it might be possible, in another world, it might be possible to temper these tendencies with strong ethical norms, such as I've observed in some Scandinavian countries. But what passes for ethics in today's bureaucratic world is nothing more than legalistic ethical codes tailor-made for Clintonian evasion and obfuscation. Perhaps the only thing that can constrain this regulatory parasitic creature is the strangulation of the host organism, the economy. And this is where the cost of regulation becomes important, both as a the possible thing that can stop this thing, and also the benefits, pointing out the benefits of perhaps reforming this. There are lots of costs. Unfortunately, most people don't quite realize how big the costs are. The most obvious cost is the administrative cost of enforcement, which of course is the budget of these regulatory agencies. And it's depending which ones you count. It's anywhere from 50 to 250 billion, which doesn't sound like much. But a much bigger cost is the administrative cost of compliance, which is paid by the people being regulated. Estimates here range from a few $100 billion to a couple of $1 trillion. Then there's the economic cost beyond that. Most people really don't get this. Okay, income is income not generated. Firms bankrupted, not created. Employees not hired. Products and services not created. One example is, of course, the FDA, and the fact that it doesn't approve certain medications. So that does cause people to die sometimes. So the point is, there's a lot of costs that, and it's very difficult to estimate. You know, it can be huge. Okay. This kind of cost is thought to be in the trillions. Okay. But you also have to be careful here, because you have to balance the cost with the benefits that also can be huge. Again, you know, the FDA or USDA, to the extent they prevent disease, and you know, the costs that they are preventing can be huge. So the benefit can also be huge, and it's very difficult to estimate it. A lot of this depends on assumptions you make, but it is very big. Okay. Now, on top of that, we have the state and local regulation, which is almost as big as and expensive as the federal one. And on top of that, a lot of the regulations on the state and local level are actually directed or co-opted or mandated by the federal government. So that's a whole other aspect of cost of regulation. So the question then is, what's the balance of cost and benefits? And that's the approach that an economist takes to this thing. And the thing is that, let me just say this much, okay? Even by the most cautious estimates, using the government's own estimates of the benefits of regulation, one can, you know, wonder about how accurate that could be. And counting only the easily visible costs, the excess of costs over benefits is at least $1 trillion per year. Now, a more realistic calculus is much closer to $2 to $3 trillion per year. Now, that's a lot. The whole economy is about $18 trillion. Okay, so imagine being able to increase that by 1, 2, or 3 trillion. That indeed is a huge thing. So one thing Trump is right about is that regulatory reform indeed has the potential of causing an economic boom and growth and increasing the economy. The only problem is that is he going to be able to figure out which regulation? Because once again, some regulations actually increase the economy and improve it, and others don't. And so the question is, you know, how do you figure out which is which? I don't see Trump doing it. So, you know. Finally, let me just offer some solutions to this drum of suggestions for reform. We need, obviously, a comprehensive regulatory reform. I call it regulatory sanity reform. And the only thing I can see, because the problem is, it's very difficult to sort of, put the toothpaste back in the tube in this case. I don't see it would be possible to really rein in all this administrative stuff by undoing it, okay? So it seems to me that the best way to fight it is, you know, like fighting fire with fire, by establishing, again, another agency. This one actually in the nature of a judiciary body. It would be independent government accounting board, and the people appointed to would be by both the judiciary, the president, whatever. I'm going to skip through that, okay, with long terms, okay, so they're not influenced by politics. And the powers of this board would be to appoint inspector generals for all major government agencies, including the Justice Department, performing financial and operational audits of government agencies, performing cost-benefit analyses of regulatory regimes, and recommend changes, and review complaints of arbitrary, capricious, and unfair use of regulatory and government power, including application of sanctions against foreign entities. That's a problem we're looking at today too. Make disciplinary recommendations and criminal referrals. Appoint special prosecutors with subpoena and law enforcement powers, so that in fact maybe we can throw some bureaucrats in jail once in a while. Any legislation established, this is the second part of this, any legislation establishing a new regulatory regime must cite constitutional authority, must provide cost-benefit analysis and by the same independent agency, and must include automatic sunset provisions. I would say no more than 25 years, probably less. Except a few, like the judiciary, military, law enforcement, and the Federal Reserve should be exempted, as should be this independent agency. Plus, I'm suggesting that the President have fast-track international treaty negotiating authority without renewal. Anyway, the only, and I can go on about the reforms, but there's a balanced budget amendment, but not quite what people normally think of that. Basically, requiring a supermajority for tax increases and spending increases. And then I would add a couple of things. One is we need educational reform, and that is to bring back civics, require U.S. English and classical history be taught to everybody, and by the way, destroy the current public education raj through vouchers. And require ethical training for all office holders and administrators, including a year internship in Scandinavia. Thank you.
Okay, we do have some time for questions or comments, so this is where we turn things over to you.
So I'm not going to pretend to know anywhere near in depth as you guys do when you're talking, right?
Speak a little louder, please.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to know what you guys know. A lot of your language is not going to live in my head for most of the part. But you talk about the Imperial Presidency, right? When people, when the presidents, go beyond, go over and above what they're supposed to be able to do. Mike, stop playing with me now.
Mic check one. Oh, yeah. When you talk about the presidents that have gone over, above and beyond the law or whatever, do you feel like the ends justify the means? Or the means justify the ends, or however you want to say it? Like, is it okay determining why they were doing it?
Absolutely not. I don't think so, because if it's the end result you're looking for, but you use a certain way to get there, nothing is to stop another administration that comes after you to use the same means to justify their ends, which you may not like all that much.
Exactly. So what I was going to ask.
So the end does not justify me.
Never.
Not well.
What about the emancipation?
I wouldn't say never. I don't think you have to qualify everything. But for the most part, you do not want, bad precedents to be set, even though the outcome is good. At least in my opinion, I think that's a very dangerous way to govern.
It is a slippery slope. That's very real. This is, as Andre pointed out in one of his comments, if progressive Democrats, if President Richard Nixon had availed himself of some of the powers that President Obama has retained, and President Nixon would have served 2 full terms as president. And that would have been a bad thing. I think you have to be, the means and ends argument is a very delicate one. To the Emancipation Proclamation, Andre's right again, there were people who doubted whether the president actually had the authority to do that. Now, the Congress did have the authority to introduce debate and send to the states the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. But I'd also point out from the point of view of technical legality, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves who were being held in the southern states in rebellion against the United States. And thus, from one interpretation, they were outside the scope. Slavery continued to exist in the Union states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri until the end of the Civil War. They weren't freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. They were freed by the 13th Amendment.
Just to add, I like your question. I mean, it's a good one. But let's try to put it in more concrete terms, too. Let's say that, President Obama uses executive orders, as he's done, to produce things that a lot of people support him and others like, right? Let's just say hypothetically with the whole immigration thing, what's to stop someone like Donald Trump, should he be elected, from using the same executive power to do something that is completely opposed, that the American people are completely opposed to, ethically? For instance, building a wall and keeping immigrants out. You see what I mean? So once you set that precedent, it's really hard to turn it back. And I think that's where Congress has a role also. Congress has an obligation to prevent presidents, from the executive, from doing that. Not just the president, but the many agencies that we're talking about. Congress has not done that in recent years.
Yeah, I was going to say, Congress is considered the legislative, correct?
Correct.
Which is above the judicial, am I right?
I'm sorry?
Which is supposed to supersede, or at least cover over or look over the judicial?
Well, they act as checks against each other, but they work in tandem, and it's three branches who are separate, but they supervise one another. That's the way I would look at it.
Okay.
And just to follow up on what Rafaele said, I can't, off the top of my head, think of a single executive order that President Obama issued with which I disagree. I disagree with the process of doing it.
So even though you agree with the,
Yeah.
he shouldn't have gone along with the way he
If
did?
the Congress will approve it, and it's clearly won't, then I don't think that the then run around Congress is appropriate. What you need to do is to win control of Congress.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I, for instance, can't think of any war that we fought that I would disagree with. But I would really, really prefer that, in fact, each president went to the Congress asking for a declaration of war. Because that makes the thing, it changes the whole nature of the thing, okay? It in fact gives the commander-in-chief actually more flexibility, because he's got the legal power to do stuff, okay? He doesn't have to, be afraid that, are they going to go along with the next step? I mean, it changes the whole character. So I think every war, every major action should indeed require a congressional declaration.
Here's the problem, though. I think Americans today, they want action quickly. They want swift action. They want things done yesterday. And because of that, the moment there is a debate, an argument in Congress, people get impatient. They think things ought to be done right away. But that's not how governance works. Not in a democracy where you have three branches. And if things happen slowly, then so be it. Better to have it the right way and slow than just having one person take power, for themselves. And even though the end may justify the means, that just completely breaks down the entire system. And so, in some ways, we're responsible for that because we want things done so quickly.
Do you think the media has a lot to do with that?
Oh, absolutely.
The way they can put it and make it seem so.
Yep. I blame the media for most things.
And the system was set up to be deliberative. It was not set up to render quick decisions, quite frankly, because quick decisions are often, hasty decisions are often poor decisions.
Ram?
Well, today's topic is about the Imperial Presidency, but perhaps we've expanded it to the imperial temper of the American people.
Sure. That's a good way of putting it.
If this is a democratic republic, then the ultimate responsibility falls upon us. Just an observation.
I think
That gets us back to the importance of education
Yeah.
of citizens.
And my presentation certainly spoke to that, to the idea of civic virtue, that all of us are responsible for, in theory, thinking of the greater good and educating ourselves, voting accordingly, acting accordingly, and insisting on that on our leaders too.
Hi. I just want to ask very smart people on the front and everybody else to open a discussion about the validity and the constitutionality of Citizens United, and how is it that it's so difficult for all of the Citizens United, to overturn something that is so negatively affecting the voting process and the nature of our democracy and our imperial presidency.
Well, I'll go first here. I think that the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, which basically largely overturned a century of regulation by Congress of campaign finance, is a primary example of the imperial judiciary. A handful of members of the U.S. Supreme Court decided that what Congress had been legislating for 100 years was unconstitutional. And there's nothing you can do once the Supreme Court declares something unconstitutional, except for to hope for a change in the composition of the court, which happens only slowly, or a hope for a change in the hearts and minds of the members of the U.S. Supreme Court, which happens even more slowly.
Well, it's defined as the imperial judiciary. It's basically when the court decides the wrong way. That's the way we disagree with, right?
No, it's the court overstepping its authority. If you believe that Congress legislates and that Congress represents the will of the people, which is, I would think, debatable sometimes, but we accept that as a premise, then no, I think that the Supreme Court, for the better part of a century, until the most recent manifestations of the Supreme Court, pretty much accepted that it would overturn only reluctantly acts of Congress. And it seems to me that in Citizens United, it breathtakingly overturned a century of acts of Congress.
I wonder, actually, what that might be. Some other decisions I can think of that you might have a different opinion, but that's okay.
Thank you. I have two statements and a question. First, you can't stop totalitarianism in totality without being a hypocrite. And a republic runs on the assumption that the Electoral College are the most educated and virtuous. My question is, are we due for more democratic avenues?
Can you clarify your first comment? You cannot stop totalitarianism entirely without being a hypocrite. What do you mean by that?
We can't replace a dictator with a dictatorship and claim that we've changed anything.
Okay.
But my question is, are we due for more democratic avenues outside of, as in possibly getting more influence on the Electoral College or making it a more direct democracy?
Somebody else can go first there.
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. Obviously, that's been discussed a lot. The short answer is there is a process, and that's called constitutional amendment. The Electoral College is built into the Constitution, although the states have some say in terms of how the electors are chosen. That really varies to some extent, or can. But I would say that would be the best mechanism. Let us use the mechanism that's built in the Constitution. If we want to eliminate or change the Electoral College, let's do it the constitutional way, which is to amend the Constitution.
And what's happened since the ratification of the Constitution is that the Electoral College has become increasingly, with the evolution of the American party system, associated with the two-party system. It wasn't supposed to be that way in the beginning. The framers of the Constitution did not envision political parties. They envisioned people of virtue, as Dr. Coan talked about, standing for office and being chosen on the basis of their virtue. Now, basically, what we have is, in most of the states, legislation that basically binds the electors to the candidate who wins the state. In some states, Maine, I think Nebraska, do it somewhat differently. That's the issue. The fact that the two-party system has become so intertwined with the Electoral College. So, and I, on my Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I think we should do away with the Electoral College. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I think it serves a purpose, and Sunday, I don't think about it at all. So.
Yeah, getting back to your first point about the dictators, I think you mean that if you topple a dictator, then you haven't necessarily improved the situation yet. Well, then the answer, I think, to that is that you should never try to topple a dictator without actually having decided to devote a lot of resources to actually create something in its place. So to have politicians talk about that we're no longer going to be doing any nation building, yeah, well, that's nice, then don't talk about toppling any governments, because Yeah, there's something worse. And we got plenty of examples of that. So the point is, I mean, if you look at World War II, we won that war and we reshaped both Germany and Japan. And I think we did a pretty decent job. But it took a hell of a lot of resources and we still have soldiers there. So the point is that if in fact we do decide to go to war, and we should decide everybody, in other words, Congress shouldn't be declared, and then we have the, you know, the authority, the will to actually do it right. You know, I mean, there's nothing worse than, for instance, not challenging some evil power, you know, than challenging and losing, which is what we've been doing so much.
Speaking of the Electoral College, there are some reports that say, should this be a close election? I don't know, I think it's an open question, but it should be close. We may find ourselves in a situation in which Donald Trump wins the popular vote, but loses the Electoral College. So, in some sense, the reverse of 2000. Who knows?
Other questions?
No.
Thank you for your answers.
Anybody else?
Yeah, so if people are not going to decide who's going to be the president, what's the point of voting then?
Well, the people do decide. It's just done on a state-by-state basis.
But then you said the electoral college is going to choose who's going to be the president.
There are them, I say, so.
Well,
Right.
yeah, what we have is, we don't have one national election for president, we have 50 state elections. And that's the key. The people in each state determine who the electors are going to be from that state.
And the electors cast the final ballot.
And there are rare cases where you have the popular vote not matching up with the electoral vote. That's kind of one of the inherent weaknesses of the Electoral College. It has happened so infrequently, though, as to not create this momentum to change it.
So it's 1824 next year.
I love that.
Yeah, that's a good
Well,
one.
that's a frightening thought.
And I would point out, just to sort of play devil's advocate, since, you know, I've sort of been on record as saying I think that the Electoral College is largely antiquated. There is a case to be made for it. And that's if you don't have an Electoral College, people in vast sections of the country where very few people live get disenfranchised. You can run a campaign for president by focusing on New York, Florida, California, Texas, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and you can win a majority of the electoral votes in those states by very narrow margins in each state. Whereas people in Wyoming, Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota get basically ignored because nobody needs to pay attention. Vermont. Nobody will get that benefit from the Massachusetts spillover, but nobody pays attention to them. So, you know, it is a way of assuring that the people who are away from the population centers get paid attention to. You have to pay attention to them. So that's the argument, I think, in favor, and I'm not sure it's compelling, but it's...
On the other hand, right now, people that live in states that are overwhelmingly Republican or Democrat, they get ignored.
That's true.
And just quickly, keep in mind that there have been a number of presidents elected with less than the majority of the popular vote, and yet a very strong majority in the Electoral College. So it's not exactly a mandate if you come into office when a majority of the voters have actually voted against you. But that's happened a number of times. I just want to hand that back there. Actually, I think this is right. No?
No, over there.
Thanks.
I have three questions. The first one is, the Constitution was written maybe 1788.
87 was the convention.
Can't it be rewritten? Because it's over 300 years now. Times have changed, lifestyles have changed. Why do you refer to Constitution which is 300 years old?
Well, let me go first, okay? Yeah, I know, and I'm actually happy that it's been so long. Because I look at lots of other countries that changed their constitutions when they changed their presidents. And it's a lot worse. So I'd much rather have the presidents change and the constitution stay the same.
And there is The Constitution has changed. The amendments to the Constitution are part of the Constitution. And there have been amendments repeatedly throughout the nation's history dealing with reforming circumstances. So, you know, we haven't gone back and looked at the three branches and all of that, but we've extended the right to vote to an increasingly large number of people. We've actually, and this is a very good one because by virtue of the 15th Amendment and the Congress basically, the Constitution basically changed to make the right to vote a national responsibility rather than a state responsibility. So,
Thank you.
A couple of things, just to piggyback on that. First off, the amendment process was one of the more brilliant things the framers did because it gave future generations the ability to change the Constitution as they see fit. So it still works. And I think the fact that the Constitution has been changed only 27 times in our history, with the first 10 happening during the constitutional debates, suggests that it has worked pretty well. The second thing is, even though times have changed, human nature has basically remained the same. And to me, the Constitution is really a study of human behavior as much as it is about politics. And, you know, it gets back to what Professor Coan said, repeating James Madison's quotation, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. And I think the Constitution has done a pretty good job in our 240 some odd years in helping to keep things in check.
Thank you very much. My second question is, you mentioned about the electoral commission or college, yeah. If this is the body which determines elections, why do we then spend money and time for the whole people, American population, to be voting, choosing people? But they are decided by the electoral commission, college.
The
As the
electors,
voters of what they do.
the electors don't get to vote the way they want. The electors have to vote the way the people in the state voted. So, even though it's called electoral college, I mean, in years past, they did have some leeway as far as I understand. But right now, they're pretty much bound by state law to vote the way the state voted. So, you know.
it's the state, it's law in each state that determines the degree to which the electors are independent. And in almost all the states, again, like I said, with the exception of Maine and I think Nebraska, by legislation, by act of the state legislature, electors are bound to vote for the candidate who carry their state in the presidential election. So they don't really, I mean, they're not really sitting there like they would. Initially, I think the idea was that they were supposed to do, sit there stroking their chins, weighing the evidence, figuring out the best person and voting for that person. No, they had to vote for the presidential candidate who carried their
I
state.
think I like that system better.
Yeah, that's the way it was supposed to work.
Well, and back to Hamilton describing it as the sense of the people would choose the president, not the will of the people, the sense of the people. The ultimate decision would be this smaller body, the electoral college.
I'm sorry for the last one. America sometimes goes to war without consulting. Okay, if they do consult the UN, I think the UN doesn't come out with any authoritative power to control whatever America does. As we saw in Iraq, it looked like America took the unilateral power to go to war. So, is UN a white elephant or something?
Well, the United Nations
Yeah.
binds no nation. The
United
United
Nations,
Nations,
yes.
the United Nations is a global participatory organization. You know, nations are free to be bound by the UN or not, as they see fit. The United States did not create the United Nations, though we were instrumental in its formation. But certainly, the UN is an independent agency, and no nation is bound by what it decides. You know, people can choose to follow the will of the United Nations as they see fit. That's just the way the system is.
And actually, the United States has gone to the UN in both cases of both Iraq wars.
Yeah.
And has received, in fact, UN sanction. But as far as I'm concerned, that's probably a mistake because the UN is not really the right body. Because all it is a discussion club. And on top of that, having 5 countries have absolute veto, it's, not really representative of anything, so.
More questions? Anybody else?
Just one more question. Just like we decided to have a Senate and a Congress, shouldn't we have an electoral college and a popular vote combination?
I think we should, you should be hired to work for the Electoral Commission to make that happen. It's an interesting thought. Now, keep in mind, Congress is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. But as far as the Electoral College is concerned, I mean, with minus the occasional blips, it has worked pretty well. And as Professor Brown said, there is a danger if you get rid of it of just canceling out the vote of a heck of a lot of people.
I don't mean get rid of it, I mean for them to work
In place.
together.
How would that work? I'm just curious.
I also,
The average of the two.
Pick the average.
I admit I made a mistake. I don't mean just like we have the Senate and the Congress, the Senate and the House
Oh,
of
okay,
Representatives.
right.
That is what I mean. They work in conjunction. Why cannot the Electoral College and a popular vote?
So like a 50-50 split to share.
I think we ought to throw it back to the House, let the House determine.
Well, what happens in Maine and Nebraska is interesting in that they award electoral votes by voting district. So actually the voters in each voting district make the decision. It's not made by the voters in the whole state. Most states it's an all or nothing proposition. The candidate who finishes first, his electors get to cast their ballots. But those states, they really try to give the people more say in each voting district in terms of who the electors will be.
One of the issues that, one of the proposals has been made from time to time about the electoral colleges is to make the electoral colleges results proportional in each state. But the question there is, if you're doing that, why have an electoral college? So,
I think the other thing is, you know, the whole idea of the Electoral College is rooted in the idea of state power, and that's what the founders intended. They didn't anticipate this federal government that completely eliminates the power of the states. We have something that's known as the 10th Amendment that places a lot of power in state government. So the whole point was to have it be a state-by-state election to preserve the authority of the states over the system. And because we've moved away from state power so much, I think a lot of people don't realize how the system was supposed to work, how it was originally intended.
And one thing more, I mean, if the problem is that it's not totally democratic, I'm not sure I care that much about that, because if you want to be totally democratic, we should govern by referendum. Referendum, in other words, have the people vote on every stupid issue. And that, to me, would be equivalent to mob rule, and I prefer not to live under that system.
Another topic. Another topic.
Other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.